This is our second day, and today it's really a privilege to have Dave Snowden with us. Dave is the director of Cynefin Centre for Applied Complexity at Bangor University in Wales. How many of you know Dave? Okay, so you guys know what is going to be next. For those of you who don't, if there's one thing I can ask you is please put away all of your electronic devices. You will not be able to multitask and listen to Dave at the same time. It is not going to work. So just sit back, relax, let Dave take you on a journey, which as I was talking to him, I said, Dave, you know, when you talk, people really have to concentrate. And he said, yes, that's because my talk are basically unconventional wisdom. So let him take you through that unconventional wisdom journey. If there is any moment during his talk that you think to yourself, oh my God, what did he say? Rest assured, you're not alone. There are probably everybody else in the room who feels the same. But don't despair, because he will take you there. And you will always be able to go back and watch his talk again and again, which is something I highly recommend. Every time you watch his talk, there will be other bits and pieces that you will catch. So I'm not going to waste any more time. Without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Dave and enjoy the next 17 minutes. We'll have a Q&A afterwards.
I now have to live up to that introduction. Turn this on. Okay. Let's get all the bits of technology working. Right. That was quite a nice introduction. I normally introduce as a professional curmudgeon, which is an English phrase that I take pride in. Just to give you an idea here, the first time I ever came to Rome was back in the 1970s, where I was summoned because I'd just written a paper to say that Marxism, Catholicism, and Hinduism were ontologically identical and therefore could be integrated. This is in the early stages of liberation theology. And shall we say, after an interview just across the Tiber, we eventually agreed that my time in the Jesuits was now over. It took them about 7 months. It took IBM 7 years, but that's different maturity of organization. I failed the test of obedience in both cases. Right? Either way, just to give you the background in this, after that I worked in the program to combat racism in the World Council of Churches in Geneva. I think I was the first Catholic to be there. And that got me involved in Aboriginal land rights in Australia, which was seminal. If you've actually seen an Aboriginal activist shot in front of you by a security guard, and when you report it to the police, you're told it's only an abo, and when nobody in Geneva will listen to you when you come back, you start to think about the world in a different way. Yeah? So that was kind of like early stages. I worked there, I worked in Africa, I worked in Latin America, and then eventually ended up in industry in the early days of computing. I'm that generation who grew up with computers. At school, we were told how to use punch card machines until we'd have a job for life, if we actually learnt that skill. We're doing the same in schools the same mistake in schools at the moment, by the way, in training kids to code. Anything we can train children on now will be done by artificial intelligence by the time they graduate. We'd be much better giving them basic courses in anthropology, design thinking, and cognitive science, because that will provide utility downstream. We always seem to train children in the previous generation's skills rather than the skills they're going to need into the future. Yeah? Either way, I grew up with that. I was involved in the early stages of remote sensing, so it's quite interesting to see some of the use of GIS now. In the days we had Landstrat and Sandstrat, and we were using physical sampling to count oranges in Portugal, and so on. So kind of like I've grown up with IT throughout the period. And I then moved on to decision support software, corporate strategy, and then IBM took us over, which was another seminal experience that was quite scary. After you've worked for IBM, you understand bureaucracy in a way that no government official can even get near, right? It's in terms of the way it works. And that pulled me into counterterrorism, which is rather ironic for a former Catholic Marxist to be hunked in to work with the CIA before and after 9/11. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about actually comes from that period of working, at looking at weak signal detection, and particularly looking at what we call human sensor networks. And one of the reasons we were doing that work is the severe limitations of what can be done with data analytics. Right? I've lived through the data analytical hype 3 times in my career, yeah? And kind of like each time I think it's been fundamentally in error, not that it doesn't have utility, but it fails to deal with things which are outlier events or things that only human beings can interpret. If you actually look at the congressional report on 9/11, it says one of the reasons there was a failure of intelligence was the overemphasis on algorithms and the underemphasis on human field agents. Yeah? So to actually see the development community going through exactly the same hype curve and exactly the same errors 10 or 15 years after the intelligence community realized it was a mistake is actually quite depressing. Yeah? Which is not to say there isn't huge value in big data, not to say there isn't huge value in analytics, but we need to realize it's limited, and we need to work on the other side of those boundaries as well as use it for utility. I think the other problem we've got, and this is the reason I'm going to start and end with T.S. Eliot, I decided I use an Irish poet rather than a Welsh poet on this presentation. Right? The English don't have poets, they rely on the Celts to provide it. Right? I'm Welsh, not English. Now you know that, it's a fatal error. Right? One of the problems we've got at the moment is that evaluation really grew on the back of neoclassical economics. And as neoclassical economics is actually largely failing, evaluation hasn't yet actually made the associated changes. I'm going to argue in a minute, part of the main problem is the assumption of causality. The assumption that there is a reason for things. It's actually quite interesting. It's not difficult to explain complex adaptive systems theory in a Hindu or a Taoist or actually a Southern Catholic environment, because they have the basic idea that some things just are. It's the way things panned out this time. But in Northern Europe and America, there's an obsession with causality, a belief that everything has some sort of reason which can be understood and managed. Yeah? So I'm going to come back to this later, but the work we're doing, which is linked in with Deleuzian concepts of assemblage, is to map the dispositional states, i.e. what is the system currently disposed to do and what is it ill-disposed to do. So we're looking at plausibilities more than probabilities. Right? Now I'm going to build back to that later. Interestingly, it matches with radical new developments in economics. If you look at complexity theory in economics with people like Brian Arthur, if you look at that wonderful book which has just been published on donut economics, which comes out of a huge movement of young economics students who have had enough about the assumption of closed systems with causal loops. Yeah, so there is a huge change coming at the moment, and the danger is evaluation will actually follow that change rather than lead it. Right? I think this is one of the ways that we become relevant. So, to move on. This is kind of like, you can't all see the slides, all right? Listening to stuff over the last day, sometimes I've felt that the future of evaluation is to be a bunch of nerds sat around a computer, yeah, doing mathematics, all right? That's a reference to Big Bang Theory for those of you who can't actually see the slide. So I thought I'd leave that as a sort of treasured moment, all right? The danger is the obsession, I think, with algorithms, right? So coming on to this, yeah. I set up last year the Cynefin Center. So I left IBM 12 years ago, started to work with the Singapore government. I built their risk assessment and horizon scanning system. The work from that went on to the point where about 80% of our work then was in the development sector. Yeah, we have a formal partnership, for example, with Stellenbosch, building a network of agents across Africa. So last year, I took all of the government work, the NGO work, the university work, and moved it into an academic setting and split off the commercial side. One of the reasons I wanted to do that is I wanted collaborative work to move the field forward, and you can't do that in a commercial environment. And we wanted to use work to link to membership-based use of software, where members of the center use the software and develop it collaboratively, rather than sort of commercial license tape model. I'll talk about that later, because one of the big programs we just launched with funding from the Welsh Assembly is to make citizens journalists to their own condition on a continuous real-time scanning basis. Yeah, for many years, I've argued you can't trust surveys, you can't trust focus groups. The theory backed me up on that, but conventional wisdom didn't. Post-Brexit, post-Trump, people are starting to pay attention. We're not listening to the street narratives, and we're privileging people who tell us stories that we want to hear from our own cultural position. If you look at the anthropological heavyweight criticism of participative action research, you'll see fundamentally the facilitators privilege the people who come, and therefore, in effect, and my background, by the way, is physics and philosophy as a joint honours, you actually contaminate the field, yeah, in terms of what you're actually trying to study from it. Right? So say that's the background to the Cynefin Centre. The other key thing to understand is that we're using natural science rather than social science. What I started to do 20 years ago is to say social science is in a very bad pace. And sorry about this, but if you have a joint honours in physics and philosophy, you're taught to despise social science from two completely different disciplines. And it takes a lot of shaking off, right? But basically, social science is in a bad place because it confuses correlation with causation. It takes an empirical model in a system which is changing so quickly, you can't rely on repeatability of originating cases. And then the alternative to that becomes an extreme form of postmodernism. And actually, you can actually look at that and say that's where we get into a fact-free society. If you say everybody's views of reality are equally valid, you shouldn't be surprised when you get Trump. It's kind of like an inevitable consequence of the way it works. So what we do is effectively to look at what natural science tells us about systems, about human cognition, and apply that to social systems and then link that back in with social science theory. For those of you in philosophy, this is a realist approach within the naturalizing tradition of epistemology. So for the academics, that's where this stuff comes from. So what I want to do is to go through some of this, and what I really want to avoid is the algorithmic accession. That always reminds me a bit of Lord of the Rings, yeah? It's kind of like the one algorithm to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them school of thinking, right? The reality is there are only 4 or 5 dominant algorithms in AI anyway. What really matters is the quality of the training data sets. And if you let the system train itself, you're creating a self-referential spiral in which you will actually ignore outliers, which is where the future comes. I'm going to keep mentioning outliers because they tend to be missed by evaluation and they're actually critical. But I'll do some of the statistics on that later. Okay, so a couple of other warnings. There's a lot of money at stake in evaluation. There's a huge amount of money at stake in evaluation. If you actually look at what happened in the American election with the use of actual bots to actually change people's perception, if you look at what's going on in fraud at the moment, right? I mean, I sort of work in this area as well. Anything an algorithm can interpret, an algorithm can create. If you think the whole of evaluation funding is immune to criminal action, you are being very, very naive. Yeah? What we're doing in terms of criminal work at the moment is to increase the amount of human agency in the system, because actually if you're just working on an algorithmic probability basis, it's very easy for criminal gangs to put more effort in than anything else. So I say this as a warning because there are softer targets than the whole development sector, but it will come. So we need to be careful on this. We need to learn lessons from other fields in terms of the way we're working. Another basic fact, the confusion of knowledge with information. This is almost a pandemic at the moment. Children actually reproduce information rather than exhibiting knowledge. Yeah, I've seen this in my students. Yeah, my master's class in Marseille, I'm probably the most popular teacher with 1/3 of the class and the least popular with 2/3 because I require them to produce material in their master's exam which I haven't taught them if they want to get a B grade or above, because they're doing a master's degree. But what they want me to do is to give them information which they can reproduce. And we're seeing the same in schools. You know, it's have I actually got the answer right? My daughter did anthropology in the lead anthropology school in Britain. She got, I'm proud of this is proud father time, she got the university prize for the best master's thesis. The original work she did for that, which was truly original, was in her first year undergraduate essay. Yeah, and I remember I had to train her to write to the marking scheme rather than think originally. Because the obsession with outcome-based measurement in education was actually destroying originality in terms of the way it works. So hold that, because this is an adaptation of me of Polanyi's famous saying, I always know more than I can say. I always know more than I can say. I will always say more than I can write down. The minute you rely on material which is written text, you're dealing with, at best, 10% of what people know. I'm going to build on that as we go through. So hold that concept. And again, that's kind of like basics. Yeah? The other thing is the confusion of correlation with causation is dangerous. Yeah? I just pulled these out for example. I quite like some of these, like the number of people who drown in swimming pools directly correlates with Nicolas Cage movies. Given the quality of the movie, I can see a causal link on that in terms of the way it works if you've got a swimming pool proximate. The one I really love is if you want to increase Nobel Prizes in a country, then increase the amount of chocolate consumption, particularly dark chocolate, because it directly correlates. Yeah, the confusion of correlation with causation is a deep problem in social science. Yeah? And actually the trouble is, if you rely extensively on correlations and repeating patterns of correlation, you can build further error into the system. Yeah? Correlation is not the same thing as causation. As I say, those are the ones I particularly like, all right? The idea that sociology doctorates create a causal factor on space launches has a particular irony to it if you look at it. Right? You can find many more of these, by the way. It's quite entertaining. The other thing is the whole issue about the loss of the oral tradition. This really worries me at the moment. One of the reasons behind the autism plague in the States at the moment is that kids are spending too much time on screens. The modern advice from cognitive neuroscience is you should spend limited time until you're 3 or 4, because actually if you spend all your time receiving information in that form, the genes which are activated are the autism genes, not the other genes. Yeah? And that's actually a major problem because of the nature of the stimulation. The other point, the oral tradition is a rich tradition. I come from it, I'm Welsh. Yeah? Now, if you actually ask me for my grandmother's stories, and one of the things we do when we do cultural mapping is to get children to interview their grandparents about the stories that should be remembered for all time. If you want to understand the culture, listen to the stories that grandparents tell their grandchildren because they're the dominant ones. Now, if you ask me for that, I would tell you the story of my grandmother. She was the last in our family to speak Welsh as a native. Yeah, at the turn of the last century, the English decided we should be educated. But of course, it had to be in English. So if my grandmother was caught speaking Welsh in the playground of her school at the age of 6 or 7, she had a wooden badge hung around her neck. That's a picture of it, called the Welsh knot. Yeah? N-O-T spelt, right? She then had to catch one of her friends speaking Welsh, at which point she handed over the knot. And whoever wore the knot at the end of the day got thrashed by the teacher. Yeah? Now, everybody in Wales can tell you that story. Nobody in England even knows it. Yeah? And those are the fundamental stories which define the way we work. I'll talk later about some of the work we're doing on peace and reconciliation at the moment. Until you identify the oral tradition, you do not understand the forming structures from which people are acting. Yeah? And the oral tradition is extremely powerful. First of all, it's authentic. Yeah? And actually, it applies in the West as well. The stories which influence people are the ones you hear around the water cooler on a day-to-day basis, not the ones written in formal documents and magazines. Yet we pay a huge amount of attention to the stories within our peer groups. One of the dangers of things like Facebook is they amplify the stories from people we want to hear. Yeah, and we all know that one. I don't need to go that into any depth anymore. The other issue is people need to tell a story in their own language. We'll come back to this when I talk about distributed ethnography. Forcing people into a second or a third language reduces the authenticity of what they can say. So again, I'm going to come back to this. What we've been focused on is allowing people to take pictures, to speak or to write in their own language. And then, key issue, to self-interpret their own anecdotal data, not to have it interpreted by an algorithm or a Western expert. Right? So the power of interpretation needs to belong to the person who contributes the material, and that, by the way, as you'll see later, will give us a quantitative approach in what is traditionally a qualitative domain. Yeah? And quant scales, qual doesn't. Yeah? And sorry if you don't like that, but I'm going to prepare to defend that later. So again, we want to deal with the oral tradition, we want to deal with traditions which are different. The way you say something fundamentally influences what it means. And the British have developed all sorts of ways of saying things with tone of voice which are deeply critical. So if I say, for example, that's a really interesting idea, it means don't go anywhere near it. It confuses foreigners quite a lot, all right? If I say it's an interesting idea, that's good. Yeah? The actual tone of voice and the context can radically change what it means. We've got some fascinating data at the moment. When people read the stories we gather in the field, they interpret them as negative. When we actually look at the way the people themselves interpret them, they interpret it as positive. Yeah? So it's very easy to get things wrong if you just actually look at the text and you assume original narrative material exists independent of the person who created it or their social context. Again, I'm just throwing some stuff out to build here. Yeah? Next, the source of the data matters. To me, this is one of the most fundamental errors in big data at the moment. I think it's because it's largely actually developed by basically technical staff, and they all have a high degree of Asperger's syndrome. If you don't know that, it's a huge advantage if you're a data analytical person to actually have mild Asperger's syndrome because it's a skill. Don't knock it. These so-called educational disadvantages turn out to be part of collective intelligence. Like dyslexia is tightly linked with innovation, for example, because a dyslexic sees connections in ways that other people don't. It's very difficult to write good Java code without being at least partially autistic. Yeah? The danger is that then perpetuates. Right? So the assumption is we don't want to deal with people. It's all too difficult. So let's just have data, and let's just run more and more algorithms on more and more data, and somehow or other it will magically work. Basic sampling techniques still count in terms of authenticity of results, but also in terms of convincing people. You've got to start with where the data comes from and make sure that's authentic before you can trust what happens. Otherwise, to use the image here, you might end up drinking water downstream from a polluted river because you haven't paid attention to the way it starts. Yeah. Next. Yeah. And now this is where I'm going to spend a bit of time. How many people know about complex adaptive systems theory? Okay, right, we're going to do 101 basics then, all right? Okay, in nature there are three fundamental types of system: ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. Yeah? Now I'm going to define these, and there's a phase shift between it. If you want a metaphor, it's rather like solid, liquid, and gas. And just to remind you, everybody remember latent heat from schools? Okay, some do, some don't, all right? My children laugh at me every year because I go out into the garden and I say, it's going to snow, I can smell it. Yeah, I grew up in the country, I can smell snow coming. Yeah? They don't because they didn't have that survival need. Right? Basically what happens is when the solid liquid becomes a solid, it throws out heat to make the phase shift. It's rather like when you boil water, you get it to boiling point, but you have to throw more heat in before it becomes steam. Right? So these are distinct systems that go through phase shifts. And I'm going to define them in terms of constraint. So a highly constrained system, that's one that is rigidly contained and rigidly coupled, is called an ordered system. Yeah? In an ordered system, you have a linear relationship between cause and effect. The same thing will happen again the same way twice. I can predict the future. I can make accurate statements about the future. And that's good news. Yeah? You don't get ordered systems in nature, but human beings have learned how to create order. So an operating theatre, for example, we now count the number of surgical instruments left at the end of an operation and check it's the same as was there at the start. As I get older, I think this sort of thing is of increasing importance. I know the percentage of people who had to have a second operation because surgical instruments were left in their bodies when they were closed up, and it's a scarily high figure. Yeah? And so everybody thinks this is a good idea. Checklists work. So they apply them in other contexts. And they forget of what goes into making an operating theatre work. You've got a 1,000-year body of knowledge, and don't underestimate the way in which professions build up knowledge over generations. Yeah? You've got an average, a surgeon will have 20 years of experience and training before they're the lead surgeon in an operating theatre. When the surgeon puts up their hand, the nurse knows what instrument to place into it without the need for instructions. Yeah? What you've got in technical terms is what is called a crew. And a crew is very different from a team. In a crew, people are trained in role and role interaction. Yeah? Therefore, you can assemble an operating team, an operating crew rather, with people who've never worked together before because they know the roles. As a result of which, practices are possible in that environment that aren't possible elsewhere. There's a high energy cost in creating predictability. Yeah, a very high energy cost. Now, I remember working with British Columbia Electricity, and they got into this obsession with checklists. Checklists work in operating theatres will have checklists. And the way they used to work is they drive out, and it's a fairly hostile environment in British Columbia. Yeah, in the summer you've got the bear problem. In the winter you've got to wear masks over your face, otherwise the coldness kills you. Right? So it's a hostile environment. They used to get together on their truck, smoke a cigarette, and talk about the job. Then some idiot of a consultant came along and actually took a social process and made it into a checklist. What then happens is the foreman looks at the list and says, "We've done this, haven't we, lads?" Ticks all the boxes. Yeah, and actually critical deaths have gone up. Right? Now actually human beings socially evolved mechanisms to provide control. You can't render all of them explicit without huge investment. Right? So I'm not saying order is wrong, but it can't always work, partly because it's non-adaptive. Yeah? A chaotic system is one with no constraints. Now that actually means that it's effectively random, which means also that it's a temporary state. Yeah, you very rarely get a system, yeah, and Axelrod famously said on this, order comes for free in nature. Yeah, basically, if you have randomness, things will start to connect and patterns will form. Yeah? So it's a temporary state. If it happens accidentally, it's a disaster. You see that with warfare, with failure of aid, whatever. You get this temporary state of chaos, but then very quickly order starts to emerge. Yeah, it's actually not formal order, but we'll come back to that. So it's a temporary state. If I can create it, it's highly valuable because it becomes innovative. If there are no constraints in play, novel connections will be found, and we don't get pattern entrainment. We're also now using it as a whole new approach to evaluation. Yeah, so to give an example, a couple of years ago, I was in Florida. I spent 3 days with my favorite client. This is my one personal indulgence. Well, it's the one I'm prepared to confess to. Which is one of the world's largest fashion chains. They don't stay in hotels with stars. If you have stars, you don't really understand quality. When I worked with their top 200, we had the Paris Ballet flown into the Moroccan desert to perform a specially commissioned ballet, and we got linen suits for the occasion, all right, because we had to be part of the scene. I'm allowed one indulgence, all right? But I went from that to 2,500 American intelligence agents. So the contrast was extreme. Yeah? Including the quality of the hotel, I should say. Right? So basically, I've got 2,500 people from the CIA, the NSA, military intelligence. I'm one of 4 keynotes with Clapper, head of military intelligence, and somebody I think I'm not allowed to tell you about. And the bastards put me on first and said that Snowden was keynoting at their conference, but didn't say which Snowden. I used to have this nice obscure name, right? But either way, after going on with this, how we say, a degree of trepidation, all right, what we then did is we presented an infographic of Syria to the whole group. They interpret it, and I'll talk about how we do that later, onto what's called high abstraction metadata, which is an ungameable approach to human interpretation, which is very different from questionnaires. Over 30 seconds, and 36 seconds later, we presented back what's called a fitness landscape, which showed the dominant views and the minority views in real time. Basically, 2,500 people interpreting the same data at the same time gives you much more objectivity than them sitting and talking about the way they work. So actually, chaos has major advantages if we use it properly. And that's something we're now extensively running. In fact, we're about to run it on attitudes to cybersecurity. We're running it as an attitudinal measure rather than a compliance measure. And by the way, that's something else we need to pick up in the evaluation community, because actually attitudes are a lead indicator, compliance is a lag indicator. Yeah, if you're measuring compliance, correction is very difficult. If you're measuring attitudes, it's very easy to intervene to steer things in the right direction. And then we get a complex adaptive system. This is one which has what are called enabling constraints. So everything is connected with everything else, but some of the connections are very loose. Some are what we call dark constraints, which is a reference to dark energy or dark matter. We can see there's an impact, but we can't see what's causing it. Yeah, so a complex adaptive system is loosely connected, patterns constantly form. If you want a metaphor for this, imagine a group of electromagnets which can change in polarity and strength, around a circular flat surface. On that surface, there are cast iron discs like hockey pucks. Oh, and if anybody wants to get pedantic with me, the disc has a high coefficient of resistance, all right? It's amazing what engineers do with metaphors if you allow them, right? So if all of the magnets keep the same polarity and the same strength, the discs will form a stable pattern. If I change one of the magnets, I can predict what will happen to the discs. If I change two, I can predict it. At 3, it breaks down. I may be able to simulate it on a computer model, but simulation isn't prediction any more than correlation is causation. What now matters, and this is a theme several speakers have taken up, is I need a real-time feedback loop. If I can control some of what we call modulators, they're not drivers. That's a major error of systems thinking. Assume that everything is driven. They're not drivers, they're not causal chains, but they modulate system effect. If I can control and monitor enough of the modulators, and I've got a real-time feedback loop, I can influence how the system evolves. Yeah? So we have ordered systems, complex systems, chaotic systems, and fundamentally, to use a philosophy, ontology precedes epistemology. The nature of the system determines how we can know things and what we can do. So the best illustration of this I've ever worked out is to imagine a real case. So how many people here have organized a party for a bunch of 9-year-old kids? Right, okay. What I want to do is to look at how we would organize a party for 9-year-old children based on which type of system we assume it is in the first place. Right? And by the way, you're holding this party in your own house. That's a major mistake. Yeah? Parents learn this fairly fast. The value of community centers is they generally have fire hoses. Fire hoses are very useful for cleaning up after the party, and are occasionally necessary for crowd control during the party itself. Yeah? So let's look at how we would organize the party based on which type of system it is. So if it's a chaotic system, that means the children are playing without constraint, without control at random. That means they'll probably discover drugs and alcohol and go on a personal experience of self-discovery. Your house may burn down in the process, but all property is theft and it was socially constructed in the first place, so why are you worried about it? There's a letter in that for certain academic colleagues. I don't recommend this. I've got a friend in California who did try it once. He's never ever going to do it again. The recovery cost is very high. On the other hand, the ordered systems approach is taught in all good business schools. Under this, you agree learning objectives for the party in advance of the party itself. The learning objectives should be aligned with the mission statement for education and society to which you belong, and should be clearly articulated and printed off on motivational posters with pictures of eagles throwing over valleys and water dropping into ponds, and placed around the room where you're going to hold the party. As the children come into the party, they should be given Disney playing cards with the party value statement printed on the back of it, so they're aware of it throughout the party. And of course, you've produced a project plan for the party. The project plan should have clear milestones throughout the party against which you can measure progress against the ideal party outcome. And the senior adult should start the party with a motivational DVD. You don't want the children wasting time in play which isn't aligned with the learning objectives. And then they should use PowerPoint to demonstrate their personal commitment to the party and show the children how their allowances are linked to the achievement of the milestone targets. Following the highly successful completion of the party, you conduct the after-action review, update your best practice database on party management, and mandate future process improvements. If at this stage, for any remote reason, the children aren't happy, you hire an appreciative inquiry practitioner who will get them to tell happy clappy stories so they have happy mental models, and suitably indoctrinated, they'll like whatever you put in front of them next time. Everybody reasonably familiar with this approach to party management? The complex systems approach, on the other hand, is much simpler. We start off by drawing a line in the sand, known as a boundary in complexity theory, and we look the children solidly in the eye, and we say, cross that, you little bastards, and you die. And one of the things you learn pretty fast as an adult is the value of flexible, negotiable boundaries, because rigid boundaries have a habit of becoming brittle and breaking catastrophically when you least expect it. Yeah? We then introduce catalytic probes. Yeah, a football, a barbecue, a computer game, in a hope a pattern of play will form, which in complexity is called an attractor. And you can only catalyze attractors, you can't create them. Yeah, you bounce the ball and see what happens. If it's a beneficial one, we either ignore it or give it more resource. If it's a negative attractor, that's where you deploy the fire hoses. So what we actually do is we manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within boundaries. And the only things that you can manage in a complex adaptive system are the boundary conditions, the probes, and the amplification strategy. Yeah? Which means that the only things I can evaluate are those three as well. Right? Now that's key, because I can't use outcome-based targets in a complex adaptive system because I can't accurately predict an outcome. Now, it doesn't mean we can't measure things, but we need to start to rethink what we're actually measuring. The only thing I know for certain about a complex adaptive system is that whatever you do by way of intervention will produce unintended consequences. Yeah? Anybody recognize what that beastie is? Any Australians here present? Okay, it's a cane toad. Yeah, introduced to control pests, but actually is now the major pest. They got the same thing with possums in New Zealand, right? People don't learn. Yeah? The one thing I can say with absolute certainty is any intervention in a complex adaptive system will produce unintended consequences, which means the bigger the intervention, the bigger the threat, and the less likely people are to admit it was wrong because of the commitment they made. So the first and most fundamental practical point I'm going to make today, if the system is complex, you do small, parallel, safe-to-fail experiments as a portfolio, which means you can abandon things which don't work, and you can amplify things which do. And of course, you can measure the impact of the portfolio, but not the individual experiment. Oh, and by the way, you increase the percentage of failure. If 30% of the experiments don't fail, you haven't broadened the experimental scope wide enough. And of course, if 30% have to fail, people are prepared to admit failure and actually move forward faster. I haven't got time to go in this in depth. There's a whole 2-day process on this. This is a huge conflict resolution device, because everybody has a solution. Everybody been there? And how do you decide between competing hypotheses about what should be done when the evidence base is very limited? Where in the complex world, you say, actually, the evidence base is limited because actually it's complex. So any coherent hypothesis gets a small amount of resource to run a small experiment in parallel, and then we see what works. Yeah, as I said before, I've done a huge amount of work in indigenous communities over the years. A lot of the techniques I've got have actually come from learning of indigenous knowledge exchange and decision mechanisms. Yeah? One of the first programs we did this was on Aboriginal health in Broken Hill in Australia. Because if you don't know it, one of the first areas we learned that you could reverse type 2 diabetes, and by the way, you can reverse type 2 diabetes. It's not a chronic condition. We're launching a big program on that shortly. One of the first areas we learned about the impact of diet and starvation was in Australia. So if you actually get elderly Aboriginals who are now, sorry, it's Aboriginals in Australia, it's Indigenous in Canada, you learn your phrases, right? Basically, if you can get them onto what's called a bush tucker diet and take them off a Western diet, you can actually reduce obesity and you can reverse diabetes. The Western technique, by the way, is chronic starvation. You have to drop 1,000 calories a day from what you need for a minimum of 3 to 6 months. And that rips fat out of the pancreas, and the pancreas then restarts. Yeah, so there's a body of knowledge on this which we came. Now, anybody who knows about Aboriginal affairs knows it's hugely conflicted. Aboriginals were classed as flora and fauna in Australia till the 1960s on the census, before they were finally classified as human beings. Children were still being taken away from Aboriginals if they were half-breed until the 1970s, and interbred to breed them back to white. I remember going back to Geneva in the 70s and saying this is genocide, not racism. Yeah, so this is a deeply traumatic area. So we basically, half a day, what problems are ordered, yeah, and out of the ordered problems, what are simple ones where why haven't we done it before? What are complicated ones which require investigation and analysis? That was easy. The complex problems were the ones where there were competing arguments about what would work. Each of those arguments, actually, if it was tested for coherence, was then given a small sum of money to run a safe-to-fail experiment. So there are 3 experiments, for example, on building food cooperatives. One experiment based on busing people on the argument that if we were working for Meals on Wheels, based on the argument that social eating rather than isolated eating. And a brilliant idea from school teachers, because if you don't know it, for older people in those communities, how the meat is killed and cooked determines whether you're allowed to eat it. Yeah, so if the emu is your sacred animal, you can have emu, but the way it's killed and cooked matters. And people were worried about the provenance of the food. So a teacher came up with the idea of sending kids into the desert to be trained as hunters so that people knew the provenance because it came from their own school. Either way, half day, all done. Went back 4 years later. Yeah? There's now a restaurant where you can buy food killed and cooked in accordance with sacred tradition at 3 times the price you pay for it in Sydney. I now claim to have invented anthrotourism to go with ecotourism. And the reason is teachers spent lots of kids into the desert to be trained by hunters, so there was a surplus of meat, and they found a way of reworking it. The cooperatives have moved, the busing experiment has been abandoned. A solution has emerged from the people themselves with minimal funding. The only people who were upset were the University of Queensland, who lost a $250,000 contract to spend 3 years investigating the problem and coming up with the right solution. Now, this is managed, measured, and controlled, but it's based on the nature of the system. Right? So that unintended consequence is a key thing to try and avoid. Yeah? So that's complexity. Right? Next thing is human cognition. Now, if anybody's about to have an X-ray, panic. Yeah, this experiment has been repeated many times. For some reason, radiologists have offended the cognitive neuroscience community. I don't know what they did, but all the experiments are run on them. So if you get, now remember, radiologists, 100-year body of knowledge, deep training, limited information span. If you give them a batch of X-rays and you ask them to look for anomalies, and on one of the X-rays you hide a picture of a gorilla which is 48 times the size of an average cancer nodule, 83% don't see it even though their eyes physically scan it. It's called inattentional blindness. The only people who don't do this, by the way, are actually people who are fully autistic. They always see the gorilla. And they can't cope because they've got too much information. That's the problem. The reason is you scan about 5% of what's in front of you and you match it against stored patterns. A radiologist has 20 to 30,000 stored patterns in their brain and their body associated with their skill and training as a radiologist. The most frequently used ones get activated first. So based on a partial data scan, human beings do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. That's effectively how we evolved. Now, evolutionary terms, you can see why this happens. Imagine the first hominoids on the savannas of Africa. Something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and how identified lion, look up best practice case studies on how to deal with lions, and by the way, pay attention to the measurement system on did you avoid them because your future income will be dependent on it, right? Yeah, by actually that time, the only document of any use to you will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I've found of how to escape from the digestive tract of a large carnivore. Yeah? We evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan. Yeah? And you can't avoid that. What happens with evaluation and workshops? You see the things that you expect to see, You privilege those things, so you're given more of them. Yeah, anybody know about the roundabout problem in Ghana? Okay, this is a famous one. It was Barbara Bush's charity. Yeah? I heard about this from Engineers Without Frontiers. She decided it would be a wonderful idea to actually fund villages to have roundabouts, children's playthings, you know, where the children run on, they go round and round. Yeah? And those would be pumps. So the children would play, water would be pumped up. Huge amount of money went into it. Obviously, didn't understand Africa. If children have got the energy to play on a roundabout, they can bloody well go out and do something in the field. As far as the women were concerned, going to the well was where they sorted out problems, all right? And so nobody used the roundabouts. But whole people had their lives dependent on the money coming in for the roundabouts and the associated evaluation. So there were literally roundabout installation groups set up to install the roundabouts for the inspectors to see and kids trained to play them. Yeah, because actually the measurement system was determining deviant action. I learned that in my commercial career. I wrote 3 ISO 9001 manuals. Anybody ever done ISO 9001? Okay, well, the CEO summoned me in and said, I need you to write the new quality standards. I said, why me? I break them all the time. He said, poachers make the best gamekeepers. Now, it's an old British phrase. And he said, you'll write something people might comply with. If I give it to quality, it will be a 50-volume manual, a 2-week training course, and will never pass. So, okay, so I took it on, and I took all the things where we knew what we should do. This is kind of like for programmers was a do case. If this, then that. If this, then that. Anything otherwise, assemble these people, they decide what to do, and they minute it. I didn't know about complexity then, but that's a good complex systems technique. You basically say, these conditions, everybody agrees what to do. Anything else, we assemble these people from these backgrounds, they minute it. Yeah? So that was a 78-page manual, everybody could learn it. Then we had a black book, the people who couldn't be trusted to answer the quality inspector's questions correctly, who had to be removed from the building if the quality inspectors ever came. And we were a secure site, so we could challenge anybody's security credentials, which gave us 20 minutes to evacuate untrustworthy managers and replace them with their nominated deputies who actually could answer the questions the way the inspectors expected them to be answered. Does any of this start to sound familiar? Yeah? People game explicit systems, right, in terms of the way it works. And one of the reasons is literally you don't see what you don't expect to see. So that's why we increase the number of human agents involved in scanning, because then we increase the chance of seeing things which are unexpected. So I'm giving the science on this. That leads into basic distribution. Everybody recognizes that. It's a bell curve. Yeah? Everybody loves bell curves. Yeah? Because the tails are so small we can disregard it. You see this with risk? Yeah, everything in the center of the bell curve is okay. Market research, most computer search algorithms work off bell curves. They're going for the center of a distribution. Okay? Now, bell curves are fine, but they don't often occur in nature. If I do a double log scale of size against frequency, I get what's called a power law. So there are a lot of small earthquakes, a small number of large earthquakes. A lot of small frauds, a small number of large frauds. A lot of small software errors, a small number of large ones. A lot of small floods, a small number of large floods, and so on. That actually, if you plot a double log scale, is a straight line, not at the top, for reasons which we can go into later. Yeah? That's actually a type of Pareto distribution. Taleb is really good on this, by the way, if anybody reads Taleb's books. Yeah, the earlier books especially. If I actually look at a Pareto distribution on the same scale, it looks like that. The tails are fat. The number of things in the center of the distribution is actually less significant than the number of things in the tails. Now, of course, if things are in the center of a distribution, I can make accurate statements about probabilities. Yeah, the number of things which have happened in the past which will repeat the same way in the future is high. Therefore, I can set outcome-based targets. I can say, in these circumstances, we need these results. And 90% of what people talked about with big data yesterday falls into that category. Yeah, things like water contamination, deforestation, etc. Those are explicit things which can be measured. We know the reasons for it. We can set outcome-based targets. I'm not damaging the concept of outcome, but it only works for ordered systems where you've got predictability. As I move towards the boundary, in a normal distribution, I can still make probability distributions, But now in a Pareto distribution, I'm talking about possibilities, not probabilities. And this is where in industry we talk about scenario planning, cone of possibilities. Yeah, we've still got enough of the past which repeats in the future. We can use the past to make statements about the future. But now, of course, we're talking about ranges of targets. Yeah, nothing wrong with that, it's valuable. But as I move further to the right, this is what Jim March in organizational science famously called the problems of samples of one or less, where you've got massive asymmetry between the past and the future. And if you go into looking at the future with the assumptions of the past, you will miss the things you do not expect to see. Which means fundamentally, we can take a deductive approach here, an inductive or case-based approach there, but the minute I move outside of this, I can't have hypotheses, I can't use case-based learning, I can't take an empirical approach. At this point, I move into what's called abductive logic, or otherwise the logic of hunches. Yeah? Now that's actually a key phrase, because abduction is what is the most plausible connection between apparently unconnected things. And as human beings, we're really good at this. Yeah? We're really good at repurposing things for novel uses. I mean, how many people have had to open a bottle of beer in a hotel late at night without a can opener? Yeah. How many things have you repurposed to do this, all right, under stress? All right? I was out on my bike the other day and I had a new gas pump for it, and I'd forgotten the old gas pump, had tire levers with it. This didn't, I got a puncture. It's amazing what you can do in a rainstorm under desperation to get a tire off when you haven't got the right instruments. We really are good at repurposing. So actually, human beings evolved to make unexpected connections between things. We're really good at it. The trouble is, it also makes us prone to conspiracy theory. Yeah? So the big issue in abduction is, how do I objectify one judgment over another? Remember when I talked about chaos? Present the same data to thousands of people, look at the statistical patterns. Yeah? Abductive research, or what we also call distributed ethnography, is a new area of research, a new area of measurement. And kind of like a final fact on this, and sorry about this, this comes from a meta-study of New Scientist, the facts are absolutely clear. There is no question that in virtually all circumstances in which people are doing things in order to get rewards, extrinsic, tangible rewards undermine intrinsic motivation. Where do you need intrinsic motivation? Health, education, development. Where do we focus people? On extrinsic rewards, health, education, development. This is science, right? I've given you the meta-study on that. There is no evidence to contradict this. There is just this mythical belief amongst economists and management consultants that carrot and stick works. The answer is it doesn't, and it's scary. The average British hospital has 511 outcome-based targets, with 22% of the budget going on managing the measurement system rather than providing health. 45% of most social welfare budgets goes on evaluation, not social welfare, and the figures are very similar in development, but the figures are hidden in all sorts of disguised ways. Yeah, so we need to rethink this. Now the work we're doing is on what are called vector measures. Vector measures measure direction and speed of travel from the present rather than where we want to go. They're still measurable because it's direction and speed of travel for intensity of effort. And actually it says we can know where we are at the moment. We can identify in the direction we want to go. But if we can start journeys, we will discover novelties on the pathway. If we have specific objectives, we can't change the journey and we can't discover novelty. So I want to be very, very clear about this. I'm not arguing against targeting. I'm saying the measurement system which underlies the target has to be appropriate to the system. In an ordered system, I can define outcomes. In a complex system, I can define vectors. Yeah, and actually, evaluation of vectors is as valuable as elsewhere. I'm not arguing against evaluation. I'm not arguing against measurement. I'm not arguing against targeting. I'm saying it has to be appropriate to the system concerned. Yeah. Which leads me on to methods. This is a phrase from a whole body of books. I don't know who originated this. I wish I'd thought of it. Homo narrans. We're storytelling apes. Yeah? It's interesting, even in modern environment, work I've done with engineering companies, the primary method of knowledge transfer between civil engineers is narratives of failure, not narratives of success. People with deep experience and professional groups constantly shares failure because avoidance of failure is a more successful evolutionary strategy than imitation of success. The reason we think people tell stories which are interpreted negatively is you're asking them for teaching stories, and we teach people through negative stories. We don't teach people through positive stories. Yeah? So basically, narrative is fundamental to the way we are. This is from work I did. If anybody reads the Encyclopedia of Action Research, I wrote the entry on narrative. All right? So this is the model which came from that. Yeah? I'm going to go through this quickly because it's written up. I identified 3 types of approaches to narrative: communication, analysis, and knowledge storing. Yeah? The oral tradition holds knowledge in story form. Yeah? And the same is true in the modern world, by the way. It's very particular. If you come to my family and somebody says after Sunday lunch, shall we go for a Sunday afternoon stroll? Yeah? Do not take it literally, because everybody else in my family will be finding rucksacks with survival food for 3 nights. Because in my family, Sunday afternoon stroll is associated with a specific incident for which I have to confess I was responsible, which involved the whole family being benighted in Welsh mountains for 1 day, all right? And ever since then, that phrase has that meaning. Now, you'll find many equivalents as you go around. Yeah? Context determines the meaning of combinations of words, not computer algorithms. Yeah? Social context is huge, and in the oral tradition, it's even stronger. So I've got storytelling, knowledge management, research, investigation, which means I've got the whole action research agenda there. This is kind of like the movement in knowledge management, which Roxanna and other people are familiar with. And then finally in IT, the concept of use cases. Now we can see this. People capture knowledges to find what's going on. They communicate through stories. Most significant change we were talking about earlier, gather stories, then use it to communicate success. What we're looking at is called micronarrative or distributed ethnography. What we want is anecdotal data. I don't want stories, I want the day-to-day anecdotes of the water cooler. Oh, and by the way, I want description, not evaluation. Because if people tell evaluative stories, it creates performance anxiety, and they try and think what the right answer is. If you get people to describe things, they're more open and you see more intervention points. We've done some very extensive programs with Roma in Eastern Europe, using Roma kids as ethnographers to Roma. Yeah? If we actually get that data and we present it to Roma experts and ask them to index it the way they think Roma index it, we get no correlation between the two. What's interesting, when you look at the Roma stories, there are multiple intervention points available, whereas the experts, they always have one form of intervention that their previous training says should happen. Yeah? So the opportunities for change are more extensive with description and evaluation. So I want that sort of narrative-based material. Now, as I say, narrative is learning. What stories do you tell your children? Yeah, Bob and Betsy stayed at home and did what Mummy and Daddy told them, so everything was fine. Anybody think your kids would stay up and let you tell stories like that? And there we did. Bob and Betsy went into the woods and met the evil witch, despite what Mummy and Daddy said, and they were almost eaten alive. But we make sure it's a happy ending at the end, because kind of like we want them to sleep that night. Yeah? All children's stories in every tradition in the world are stories of adult failure, not stories of adult success. We learn through failure, we don't learn through success. We actually build now worse practice systems for organizations because they have more knowledge transfer capability than best practice systems, which engender exactly the same response from people as happy, clappy stories do from intelligent children. It's actually, we are, as a species, we've evolved as malicious gossips. Because actually, negative stories have survival capability because failure repeats, but success rarely does. When we now provide direction in communities, we create boundaries of negative stories, but we don't tell people what to do because we want them to discover novelty, but within the boundaries of the learning of the past. And again, this sort of contradicts conventional wisdom, but to say it's based on science. And then the final question, this for me is the huge big one, is who the hell interprets the story? The power of interpretation is far more powerful than the story. I can tell you a story, then you interpret it. You have the power over me. What I was paranoid about in this for years is we need to transfer the power of interpretation to the storyteller and away from the story interpreter. And of course, stories are profound. This is from Alistair MacIntyre. If you haven't read his work, he's one of the new Aristotelians. Like me, he studied under McCabe at Oxford. Basically, I love this phrase, if you deprive people of their stories, you make them anxious stutterers in their own existence. Yeah? And I gave you my example of the Welsh knot. What we're doing across Africa and Latin America and Asia is encouraging people to tell the stories that we want to hear from our own cultural tradition, rather than listening to their own stories, their own authenticity. Yeah, and that's the inevitability of the way we actually gather material. And the danger is with data algorithms, it will be exaggerated. It will be amplified very quickly in an uncontrollable way. So the question of power to me is key. So, human metadata. This is starting to show capture. First of all, I was going to demonstrate this, but we can't get the iPad to work, so I've switched to the iPhone, right? And I haven't got the software loaded there. I want to capture people in written form, photographs, drawings, or text. I don't want to force people into text. I want to capture it in any form. If I look at the work we're doing with nurses, for example, a nurse might want to take a picture, say something and write something, and record a patient story. All of that is an anecdotal data point. Now, I don't have to worry about that because I'm not going to interpret it, and neither is a computer going to interpret it. The person who contributed is going to interpret the collection of data at the time. Okay? Now, key here, we want high abstraction metadata. We know, for example, that questionnaires don't work. Anybody done an employee satisfaction survey in their life? Okay, we got this in IBM, all right? It came through to me and it said, does your manager consult you on a regular basis, scale of 0, not at all, 10 all the time? Does that sound familiar? I've seen this in an awful lot of development evaluation as well, right? And you know exactly what answer they want. So I phoned up HR and I was on a watch list with HR. I'd run a 6-month research program which proved Myers-Briggs was less accurate than astrology in predicting team behavior. And we knew American vice presidents didn't get irony, but they definitely didn't like ironic research. So either way, I got straight through to the worldwide head. And I said, how am I meant to answer this? I've got several managers. I've got other people I take business direction from, and I've got powerful people. I do what I'm told, otherwise I'm in trouble. And I said, sometimes they consult me and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they should and sometimes they shouldn't. This is a context-free nonsense question. What do you want me to do? And she said, average your experience over the year and stop causing trouble. Yeah, laugh, but you go and look at many of the questionnaires issued by this and other organizations, you'll see the same error. They're context-free, evaluative. And actually the trouble is, people give you the answer they want. If they're in a bad mood, they score low. A high mood, they score high. Yeah, basically, it's the most recent experience is biased what they do. We've done that where we get patients to continuously tell stories throughout their stay in a hospital. The results are radically different than if they do an evaluative questionnaire when they leave. Because when they leave, it's fundamentally biased by whether they got well or not, and the fact they don't want to say nasty things about nurses. Therefore, you can't trust the results. So questionnaires are faulty in that. Focus groups, by the way, for those of you who run workshops, biased by the facilitator within 15 minutes on average. Yeah, within 15 minutes, you start to privilege some stories over another. You can't avoid it, yeah, because you're in a position of power within the group. Yeah? So high abstraction metadata works in a different way. So we go to say, I'll do the employee satisfaction survey example. We go to say 10% of the workforce every month because we don't want a once-a-year survey because by the time we get the results, it's too late to do anything. How much evaluation is based on long periods of time? Yeah, which is actually you want early response mechanism. So we go to 10% of the employees every month and we ask a non-hypothesis question. What story would you tell your best friend if they were offered a job within your workplace? And then we ask people to interpret the story rather than evaluate the company. Right? And that's really important. We ask people to interpret a context-driven story rather than evaluate the company. Another one we do is give an example of a decision made recently which affected you personally, which summarizes the culture of the organization. Yeah? And then the triangle for that, yeah, because we use triangles for this method we developed and patented. Basically, we say, in this story, did people act intuitively, analyze it logically, or make decisions based on principles? Now, the point about this is you've got 3 positive qualities. What that does is it increases the cognitive load on the respondent, so they move from autonomic to novelty receptive processing. Those of you who want the positive literature, the popular literature, that's the difference between thinking slow and thinking fast. Yeah, if you go to Kleiderman's work. We don't want people responding quickly, we want them more reflective. The way you make them more reflective is you increase the cognitive load. 3 balanced positives does that. And normally there'll be 6 of these triangles. You see where I'm getting quant data from? Yeah? That shows a result with each dot coming out as a narrative. You can now see a pattern. You can see in this organization they'll be good analytically, they'll be very, very poor if they get a crisis. Yeah? And basically on a principle basis, by the way, we use this to detect fraud and corruption. The number of decisions made on principles indicates the degree to which they're fraud. It's a weak indicator. If you look at the color coding by department, you'll find there are some departments with no decisions here at all. I'm going to go look at that. A vector target for this organization is to have that evenly distributed by the end of the year. And of course, that's not gameable, because you've got to change the stories that people tell and how they interpret them. Right? So that's the basic concept of high abstraction metadata. But then it gets much more sophisticated. Right? This is called a fitness landscape. It comes from evolutionary biology. This measures a dispositional state or the energy gradients required to move between systems. Yeah? Now, this is actually looking at safety. I'm deliberately not giving you development sector examples because you'll start to worry about the examples. I want you to think about the theory and see how it applies. Yeah? This is looking at safety. Here we've got engineers in a manufacturing environment continuously capturing narrative of their own experiences in return for not writing end-of-shift reports. Yeah, we did this first with the American Army in Afghanistan. If a company commander keeps their field records up to date, they don't have to write a patrol report. We're now doing that for development workers. Development workers, if they keep continuous capture of narrative in the field, don't have to write an end-of-visit report, because, of course, the end-of-visit report is biased and limited, whereas the day-to-day observations are stronger. You're looking for this real-time response mechanism. Right? That, by the way, is available to anybody who's a member of the centre. We're extending that. The left of this is civilian manufacture. The right is military manufacture. And this is a probability distribution, so this is truly ungameable. The vertical dimension is rule compliance. The horizontal dimension is job completion. Now, you now see another principle of sense-making. The representation should tell you what it means without the need for somebody educating you. You can see in civilian manufacture, you either get the job done or you follow the rules. The two are mutually incompatible dispositional states. Every questionnaire, every focus group, every interview says they're doing both because people know that's what they're legally required to do. But the day-to-day micro-observations with high abstraction metadata tell a completely different picture. Nobody on the board challenged this when I presented it. Yeah? The right is military. And you can see there's a really positive pattern of people following the rules and getting the job done in the top right. When you click on that, you discover it's actually nuclear weapons testing, which creates an existential quality to rule compliance and job completion that would not work in another context. And then we've got get the job done, ignore the rules, and this really depressing one, I'm going to do what I need to do to survive. Now, just to get you worried, we're finding that pattern in hospitals and social workers in the UK and in several development projects. The excessive constraints of rules is forcing exactly the opposite of what we want to achieve, and now we can represent it. And now you see a whole new theory of change. If you look at the right-hand picture, you see 2 blue arrows pointing to a small cluster of observations, which in complexity is called an adjacent possible. That's a state close to where we are, which is achievable as a stepping stone. to move everything to the top right is too far. So I now literally put my finger around that on the screen. I can't show this, sorry, because I'm not on the iPad. Anybody wants to show it, I'll show you later. I put my finger around the screen, and I see the original observational data point of the engineers without any interpretive layers. This is called disintermediation. And I say, what can I do to create more observations like these and fewer observations like those? And I referenced this in a group yesterday. This is called fractal engagement. As a board, I say, what as a board can I do to create more like this, fewer like that? I don't say, what do my employees need to do? Because every factory has got their own landscape map from the same source data. So now in a factory floor, I say, what can I do tomorrow to create more like this, fewer like that? People are going in different directions appropriate to their context. In hospitals, hospital administrator, what can I do at a hospital administration level to create more like this, fewer like that? Ward, disease group, nurse group. You see the principle of fractality? You get the system to represent itself in real time, and then you address it at a level appropriate to your own decision authority. And I say that's a radical transformation, because more like this, fewer like that, everybody can understand. When we did this in Mexico, we had people outside the churches gathering the stories that Mary of Guadalupe would say to the people of Mexico today. You don't ask for questions about drug barons in Mexico because you die. Church project, huge amount of data. I can then go to people in a school and say, what in your school can you do to create more stories like this, fewer stories like that? Not what you do to create a culture of legality, because that privileges the Western facilitator, not the people on the floor. And then in terms of peace and conflict, this is from work we're doing at the moment, where we've presented an infographic about the future to several thousand people. And they've all put it onto metadata in real time. This is the result. You can now see that basically green and blue, there's no point in sitting them down to talk about things. They're so far apart, that's the wrong intervention strategy. Yeah? Actually, red is an overlap area. The strategy, by the way, here is to make the extremes of blue and green more extreme, so they split off, and the center move in. To say this is the same approach we do on real-time decision-making. Remember that you don't see the gorilla? If every radiologist put their interpretation onto a landscape, you would see the 17% as a cluster, and you pay attention to it. Because the 17% come to believe they didn't see the gorilla if they talked to the other people. Yeah, we like to conform. Okay, so winding up on this, this is another example, work we did with PW. It's a good example of triangles. Last year, they asked people, what's important to your business? Yeah, strategic direction, operational capability, ability to disrupt the market. 3 Likert scales. Everybody scored them in the high 90s. We put all 3 onto a triangle. Ability to disrupt the market disappeared in several countries. Now, this is starting to show speed of implementation against sophistication. It's an equivalent that we've done in the development sector. I'm trying to show this analytics has value. What matters is where the source data comes from. So by allowing people to generate their own source data in a human sensor network, we have the value of large numbers without anything else. This is actually from, if anybody's in Africa, in July, there's a whole one-day summer school on this at Stellenbosch. Yeah, winter school, sorry, I'm getting my hemispheres wrong. Stellenbosch are building a network of universities across Africa to provide support for this. We're doing the same in the Americas and elsewhere. And then finally, I'm just going to run through a couple of programs. Engage, Empower, and Act. I'll put the slides up later on my blog with a link to this program. I've been arguing for this for some time. Welsh Assembly have now put £100,000 in to get it started. We're going to 3 Welsh valleys, the people who voted for Brexit against their own self-interests, where the elite are not listening to the stories in the field. And every 16-year-old in every school and every community centre and sports club will send their young people into the communities to gather narrative on a monthly basis. Okay? We're doing this with the Future Generations Commission. If you don't know, Wales is the only country in the world, and we are a country, which has actually passed legislation which says no act of the Assembly can be passed without taking into account the needs of the next generation. And there's an independent commission which audits that before legislation goes through. So we're working with them. So what we're doing is seeing the present and the past through the eyes of the future. So the children are going to their grandparents, their parents, they're gathering narrative. From that we're drawing landscapes. That means a Welsh minister can look at the picture for the whole of Wales and say, what can I do as a minister to create more like this, fewer like that? Or they can say to a community, if you could create more like this, fewer like that, we'd fund your community centre. This, by the way, is also based on work we did with the UNDP, which is not to ask people to apply for grants, but to get evidence of their ability to amplify grants at a lower level early. Right, so there's a whole body of knowledge on this. And basically that's extending along citizen journalism, putting human dampeners, go through those, yeah? And also health journeys. Now these are programs we're now starting to run collaboratively that organizations can join. That citizen journalism concept is about to be picked up in Finland and Australia and New Zealand, and also 3 American cities. So the concept is you build a human sensor network using your young people through your schools, which satisfies all sorts of requirements, and then you evaluate programs on whether they change the day-to-day narratives rather than linking the narratives directly to each program. You see what we're doing? We're getting the system to model itself in real time by using the citizens as a sensor network, and then we're seeing the impact, and that allows us to look at catalytic projects and multivariants. I almost said this in one of the sessions yesterday. It's very easy to get a correlation between a single disease group and big data, but very few people suffer a single disease. You're talking about multiple morbidities. Yeah? And the same is true in social conditions. There are multiple factors in play. You're never going to get single-line correlation. Okay, so some closing statements. I'm just giving you some hints of where we're going on this stuff. One of the big things at the moment is anticipatory triggers. Is once you've got a body of narrative, you can trigger human beings to a heightened state of alert when they need to pay attention to something. I won't go into that, and I won't go into that, and I won't go into that. Yeah. I want to finish off on this because I've been looked at by the chair. Right? I'll write those up later. I started with Eliot. I want to finish with Eliot. Yeah? Famous poem, right? Where is the knowledge that we have lost in information? If we focus on, and you could add to that, where is the information that we lose in data? If you focus on data, if you focus on information, you lose knowledge, and God help us with wisdom. Yeah? And the final statement is the one I made at a conference long ago. If AI ever replaced human intelligence as opposed to augment it, yeah, then basically we decided to meet computers halfway. Yeah? Basically, we reduce ourselves to dust. Human beings are far more than data processors. And one final scientific fact for you. Cave painting comes before language in human evolution. Art comes before language. Our language evolved from abstractions, not naming things. In evolutionary terms, abstraction allows us to make novel, unexpected connections. Yeah, that's called acceptation or repurposing. In a modern world increasingly threatened, we need real-time feedback loops which allow us to create novel solutions to problems which appear to be intractable. We won't do that if we focus on data analytics as an end. If we use it as a tool to supplement or complement the capability of human beings, then we may have a chance. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dave. I hope my forecast to the audience was correct when I started. We have 5 minutes because Dave went to overtime.
You started 5 minutes late.
Okay, we have 10 minutes then. So questions from the floor for Dave.
At this point, a silence normally descends on the face of the... Yeah. Now, we've had dinner together, so you've got privileged information here, all right?
You have to admire someone who starts with T.S. Eliot, so that's a... The question I wanted to ask, this is all very fascinating, all opposed to how development evaluation is done in most cases. So I'm just interested in what you think are some of the potential intervention points for working with large development agencies. I've given quite a lot of workshops on complexity and find there's a great resistance because many agencies are structured around results-based management and complexity is things they can't control, so that they don't want to sort of know about it. Unintended consequences, quite a few agencies say, we don't have those because we have a good system, and if we did have them, there's nothing we can do about it, so forget. So I was just interested what you think in this cruel worldview. What are some of the potential intervention points?
I think some of it is the way you actually run with it. So, for example, we're saying you replace outcome-based targets with vector-based measures. A lot of people in complexity are saying you can't measure, and they're wrong. Yeah? So they're creating a hostility towards complexity because they're saying it's all about just letting people do what they want. And anybody with children knows you don't do that, all right? Yeah, that's a fundamental principle. I think it's also collaboration. I mean, the last 5 years, we've gone from a few pioneers to actually a lot of practitioners. So, for example, Oxfam, the Red Cross, are members of the centre and running multiple projects. Yeah, I've had reported on a project yesterday. You've got to give people tools which represent the data so they understand you deal with things differently. Yeah? The danger with big data is it's encouraging people into deterministic linear causality because it's giving them a false impression of causality in terms of the way it works. And so in my experience is you're also selling probably to 13 or 20% of the market at the moment. Because what happens is new ideas come in, you get really early adopters, then you get people who care, and you don't worry about the rest because they always follow. Yeah? So at the moment, what we're attracting into the centre is agencies who know they've got intractable problems, but they're working together collaboratively. So for example, on patient journey, which is a huge issue worldwide, 10,000 Voices in Northern Ireland was us, right? One of the most successful ones in Europe. We're now putting together health boards across the UK to spend 3 days designing a version of the software, which they can then all use for patient journeys generally across the health service, including obesity reduction. Yeah? So the whole goal is collaborative working together, having originally proved an idea with different tools or techniques. So the key thing is to recognize things are moving, right? The fact the Welsh government has supported the concept of human sensor networks, that's now easy to replicate with other governments. Yeah? We've socialized this with the World Bank already. They're interested. You can imagine a situation, and this is where I want to be in 10 years. Every 16-year-old in every school in the world is a journalist to their own condition every month. That's eminently achievable at relatively low cost. And that gives us a database which goes way beyond anything we can do with big data because we've got a controlled sample at the front end. And of course, stuff we're talking about with the Red Cross, you can activate the network when there's a disaster rather than activating it 24 hours later using social computing. So the world's changing. Yeah.
Okay, there's a question over there. Sir, if you could please introduce yourself and make sure you have the mic close to your, as you're speaking, or else people can't hear.
Thank you. I'm Rupert Simons. I'm an Englishman and a European, so I second your point about the English having no poets.
And Shakespeare was born so close to the Welsh border that we claim origin.
Counts, right? Yeah. So I'll ask a question about the work I do, which is on transparency. I run Publish What You Fund, which is a transparency campaign, and there's a premise behind all our work, which is that more information will, when put out into the world, result in better decisions and more learning and more accountability because people will find useful things to do with that information. Over the last few years, I've grown increasingly skeptical of that premise. I wonder if your experience in applying complexity thinking would lead you to be supportive or skeptical of that premise.
There are many advantages to having a philosophy training. One is you know about Aristotle's golden mean. Yeah, any human virtue is the average of the virtue not present or the virtue taken to excess. And the problem we got with transparency is if you have too much transparency, nobody innovates. Yeah, because nobody takes a risk. If you have no transparency, then you get fraud. So the issue is the balance between the two. Yeah, I think the other is the nature of the information, and thanks for the question. Yeah, I won't thank an Englishman in the rugby season, but we're together against the New Zealanders now, so we have this temporary bond in nature, right? It happens once every 4 years, right? That's enough, right? But basically, one of the great things about the approach we've created, and it came out of the came out of the intelligence sector, where you've got a bigger problem with transparency and data than anything else, is the person who tells the story decides whether it can be shared or not. Yeah? But that doesn't matter because they're sharing their metadata. So there's a massive ethical problem with narrative research. Because you're interpreting a narrative, you have to worry about the narrative. We don't. And so we've done work with Aboriginal groups where actually they designate which members of which tribe and which age groups can see it, because the person who tells the story can withhold the story, but they can share the metadata. So I think what we're saying is that's a different type of transparency. Yeah? And then the data is something, more stories like this, fewer stories like that. Yeah? And I say we've done this with 360 feedback, for example. So if a leader gets people to tell observations about them and they see a pattern, they see all the stories are withheld, it tells them as much as if they can read the stories, yeah, in terms of the way it works. So I think there's hope, but complexity requires us to think differently, not to just replicate current processes. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question there, and then I know we have a question from Twitter. Okay, so go ahead, sir.
Thank you, David. It's Hamid Sultan, Islamic Relief Worldwide. We're talking about poets, sort of as an Englishman of South Asian origin. I'm into the Persian poets quite a bit. So,
and we could get to the Mullah Nasruddin, who I see is actually on the wall outside there, which I'm very impressed with, that you've got the Mullah Nasruddin.
I did notice, yeah. In the workshop yesterday, we were talking about various issues as well. I agree with the big data issue. The worry I have is about discursive constructs, that sort of that big data could actually become a discursive construct and force things into a certain route.
It is.
And that's what worries me, and it sort of wanted to get your sort of thinking on
No,
that.
I think it really worries me extensively at the moment, because at the moment it's he who controls the algorithms is starting to control the will. Yeah, if you look at what happened with the Russian hackers on the American election, what they did is multiple probes to see if they could create negative tropes and then reinforce the ones which worked. Yeah. So, and this is a bigger danger, all right? We saw the same with Brexit, all right? Yeah, the minute you got big data in your social computing, I said, I think 15 years ago, it's going to be the threat, not the success. It's not, it's dangerous because it reinforces beliefs. So you don't see things you don't expect to see. I could tell you a story later about when I was chucked into the Midwest and asked to argue against Trump in a bar one day immediately after the election. That was a fascinating experience. But I won an argument, and the guy just pointed to me and said, that's his education speaking. And that dismissed my ideas, right? So we're creating a world in which people are influenced by small negative encounters with multiple anecdotal data. And the parallels with the Weimar Republic are significantly scary. I mean, remember I talked about the Pareto curve? So there's a whole body of stuff on this, the apex predator theory. If you get a lack of diversity in the dominant power system, which we got with neoliberalism, then you create space for extremists in the tail. And some of them will come through. Yeah? And actually you can see that with Trump, you can see it with UKIP, yeah? You can see it all over the world. If you haven't got diversity in the center of the distribution, so people have got genuine choices, you get extremism, yeah? And the danger is what we're seeing with social computing, with data analytics, is an extreme form of isolation of smaller and smaller groups. A friend of mine, Canadian Mounties, lovely phrase, he said, it used to be every village had an idiot. And that was okay because we all knew who the idiots were. But now all the idiots have created an internet group to validate idiocy, and the contagion is spreading. And that's actually what's happening. It's really scary. What I'm doing with Children of the World, which is the other name for Engage, is we need human agents as dampeners in the system. We need to radically increase the number of human agents at the source data because they will dampen the propagation effect of algorithms.
Great. I know there is, yes, ma'am. And then we need to go to the Twitter question. Yes, ma'am. If you can just also introduce yourself. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Lucy Omund from UN Habitat in Nairobi. Just wanted to get your thoughts on technology. Do you take technology as a facilitator of development or an additional barrier?
No, I think it's a huge additional development, but it's fascinating. We find, I hate it when people use paper forms, because actually we found the tactile nature of a smart pad. Illiterate communities find that easy. Yeah, to move things around pictorially on a screen is easy, whereas actually paper, again, privileges the facilitator or the enumerator. And we're eliminating enumerators by getting people from their own communities. So I think technology is going to make it easier as we go over time. I mean, originally, the example, we have a technique we index. So we used to record somebody's story and put a canvas sheet on the ground and get people to put stones on the canvas with symbols, and the canvas had a grid. And then we could photograph that, and that gave us index data. Right? We've now incorporated that into the main system. So people literally place stones on a grid. So for example, with nurses, high empathy, low empathy, tolerable pain, intolerable pain. This is how I see it. This is how I think the nurse sees it. This is how I think the doctor sees it. Right? Now, we can do that graphically with pictures. So I think technology in people's hands so they can capture their own experiences and record it. And what we're doing in Wales is the kids in community centres in Wales, we've got 5 generations of unemployment in some valleys now. Yeah, kids haven't seen money in their family for 3 to 4 to 5 generations, which means we've got an epigenetic effect, which means obesity is a biological predisposition, not a sociological predisposition, right? Now, for those kids to be able to sit down and say, what can we do to create more like this, fewer like that? And we're running small hackathons in community centres for them by which they can be trained to use the technology, but only if they bring somebody from their grandparents with generation with them to work as a pair. So we get the older generation working with the younger generation on an evidence base to argue for what's needed in their community. So I think if we distribute technology into communities and we make simple systems which can represent stuff, we're getting there. If we privilege the language of the West in the cultural interventions we're doing, we won't get there.
Okay, the last question goes to our virtual audience. So the question that we received through social media.
The question is from Dilip Singh Bayas on Twitter. Is there a need to integrate knowledge goals in sustainable development goals?
Knowledge goals?
Yeah. Knowledge.
Yes, it is, but I think what you've got to do is you've got to start to link anecdotal experiences. There's a key concept in cognitive neuroscience called conceptual blending. Right? So we scan about 5% of what's in front of us. That triggers a recall of our own experiences and experiences of other people. Yeah? And then we blend that together to come up with a unique form of action. Right? That's how we evolved to make decisions. So knowledge systems need to reflect that. Yeah? And the idea that you codify knowledge, I mean, you've heard this as well. I heard it yesterday, all right? You can have all the PDF documents you want, and you can put them in all of the communities of practice you want and all the publicly available databases you want, and a small privileged elite will get access to them, but nobody else will. Yeah? On the other hand, if you have original anecdotal data and people can look at patterns and get the patterns in real time, then you've got a knowledge system which can be linked. And the way you handle goals is more stories like this, fewer stories like that, negative boundaries and positive directions, yeah? And you link that with the Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah? But the knowledge base has got to reflect the way human beings evolved to make decisions, not the way that computers find it convenient to store information.
Thank you, Dave. You will have more time to interact with Dave during the coffee break, but it's always a pleasure, Dave, to listen to your talk. Thank you. And I want you guys to give yourselves a round of applause for sitting down and listening to Dave for 80 minutes. Okay, so what we're going to do next is we have a tech fair outside. This is really the first for IFAD, and I would like to ask Oscar to open it up formally, and after which we are going to have a coffee break and more breakout groups. Sir, sorry, sir, we haven't finished. If you just take your seat for a minute. And what we'll do is we'll have a coffee break, and you'll have another series of breakout groups. We will meet back in plenary at 2 o'clock for a panel discussion on data visualization. If I may please ask Oscar to come and give the opening remarks for the tech fair.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. We have had a very rich presentation and discussion, and I'm very thankful for that to Dave Snowden. As we have seen, conducting evaluations in complex systems, complex adaptive systems requires new tooling. new tools. And therefore, this tech fair opens the opportunity to explore some of those new tools. We wanted to have the experience of the different theoretical and practical examples that we have had from the presenters on how technology can potentially be used for data collection, analysis, and the potential of applications for evaluations. And in addition to listening to different examples, we thought that it was a good opportunity to have the experience of these tools. And therefore, we have invited a number of vendors from the private sector, NGOs and international organizations. I want to thank ACVO, Aptative, Development Gateway, Dobilities, Service ETO, EcoMobile, Energy, PEDIA, Relief Applications, GNU COP, Tropical Health, FAO, TechnoServe, Textifier, and A Better Deal for Farmers for their presence. And I want to invite you to interact with our vendors at the Tech Fair for the next hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oscar. And you will have an opportunity to interact with them also throughout the day. So we're going to break for coffee. The breakout groups will start at 11 o'clock. We will meet back in the plenary at 2 o'clock for the data visualization panel. Thank you very much.